Today, we're going to talk about subgraphs and how to create them and how to implement them. And subgraphs are really useful because they allow you to package up a lot of matrix transforms or whatever it is that you're trying to do within your rig graph so that you don't have to have crazy component scripts where you're doing everything with code. Let's set up a really simple matrix transform and we'll create a subgraph and then we'll load it back in with a component script. So to start things off, I'm going to make a skeleton. I'm going to make two joints here. I'm going to make one and then two, and I'm going to keep them disconnected from each other. And I'm just going to go ahead and pack this. This will be our base skill. I'll put down an auto rig component and do my FK transform, plug this into here, make sure that we're just grabbing the rig, and I'll throw down an apex edit graph, and here we go. So this is the basic setup for creating subgraphs, right? In my rigging, I do this a lot. So you create your nodes, right? You make sure that you create your nodes, and you have your basic setup up top, right? So maybe you have like an arm rig or a leg rig, and you want to test out, or you want to find, or basically you want to create a tool. So first thing is you separate everything out into just its base parts, right? So we have a really simple setup. I create the nodes, and now I can create everything manually, okay? And the idea is to create it manually, the exact setup that you need, and then pull it back into your larger rig. So when you're creating tools, you work in a really simple context. You create your tool, and then you pull it back in to your full rig. So in this case, I'm just going to create a really simple, let's go back here. I'm just going to create a tool that creates another control, or that'll take a transform object and just blend it between these two positions. So let's pack this back up, okay? And this will be our base rig. And I'll put down an apex scene animate. Okay, so now I have my animate context. I'll go back to this edit graph and pin that. So now I can see how things update within my animation context. All right, so I'm going to throw down a transform object, and I'm going to call this, midpoint CTRL for midpoint control. And essentially, I'm just going to, let's see, do a transform blend. I'm going to plug the result into, I'm going to plug it into the rest local in this case. And if I want to see this transform object, I need to promote this. I need to promote one of these parameters here, the T, the R, or the S. So the T stands for translate, so I'm going to promote that. Okay, I'm going to reset my scene animate, make sure that everything is working. And now if I go into my transform blend and I work this blend, now I have this blend in the center here. Okay, so this is a really simple setup. Like you don't even really need a subgraph for this really, but imagine that we're doing something a lot more complex. So I'll put in a value float. Okay, we'll put that into our blend. I'll call this the bias. And if I mess with this, now we have our float connected into there. Okay, so now I have my tool, which is pretty cool. Very, very simple tool. And I can still go in and move this guy around. And to make this more interesting, why don't we put in a transform build, and I'll put down a multiply matrix. So we're going to take this, this position here, right? The position between these two guys. And then we're going to do a pre-transform on our build transform here. So, right, I'm going to click on this, and actually, let's put down a value vector. I'm going to put that into the T slot. Put this into the first slot of our multiply matrix, that into the second slot, and this into the rest local. Let's update our scene. All right, things aren't working, and that's because I did not put down a value vector. So value vector 3, let's put that into here and reset the scene. Okay, so now I have that. All right, so now I can actually, with this value vector, I can update the initial position of our guy here. See, so I can move it up. And then with the bias, I can move this back and forth, okay? In case we want to have a little bit more control over our starting point of our mid control. So now what I can do is I can take all these matrix calculations and package this up into a subnet, okay? And one thing I typically like to do when I'm doing this is I'll make a copy of this. So I've created my tool, right? And it works. And I don't necessarily want to lose this because if I'm jumping in and editing, it might, maybe I'll unplug something and all of a sudden it stops working and, I don't know what the hell I just did. So what I like to do is I like to make a copy of my setup. And then this over here, I'll even disconnect it. This will be where I create my subgraph. So I'll take all this, put that into, collapse it into a subnet, and I'll jump in. And now I can actually start naming things. So when I'm writing my component script, and I'll want access to my initial position. So I want this float and this vector to be exposed. So I will expose them. So let's grab our float. We'll call this bias, and we'll call this position. And let's rename these X forms here. We'll call this root and tip, and the output, we can just leave that as result. Okay, so here's my tool. And so far, the inputs haven't been renamed. So it's kind of weird. If you select out of it and then select back into it, things are renamed. And now everything gets disconnected. So watch out for that because you might have a really elaborate setup. And then see, this is why I like to leave the original manual setup, because once you go in and rename everything and you jump back out and the names update, everything gets disconnected. So just be careful when you're creating your subnets and you have a really elaborate setup and you don't want to lose it. Okay, so we'll call this something like middle pose, or let's call this blend pose, right? And now I'm gonna move that to the side and delete everything else, okay? Because I just want this, right? This is my subgraph here. So what I do, right, if I wanna be able to pull this in to a script, is I need to give this a name. Make sure that we're on a primitive class. I'm going to call this blend pose, right? So this is going to be the name that I'll need to use in my callback in my component script. I'll put down a file cache, change this to explicit, make sure that we're on frame. And I'll navigate to my Houdini folder and dive into this Apex graph folder that's within the Houdini 20 documents folder. And I'll call this blend pose, BGO, and save. And now the next thing that's required is you have to, and again, people, this thing is in beta, so there's a lot of kind of weird runaround things you have to do. You have to quit out of Houdini and then load it back up again. And I've talked to a couple of devs and they said that they're gonna make this process a lot easier. But this is, for the moment, this is how you do it. So I'm gonna quit out and we'll load the project back up again. And then we'll create a component script to pull this blend pose subgraph back into our rig. Okay, so we're back inside of our project. And if I throw down an Apex edit graph node, and we'll make sure that this is open. I'll close this window here. And if we look for our node, we'll find that it's now loading it in. So it's really important that you throw your nodes into that Apex graph folder under the Houdini 20 folder. Because once you throw these BGOs into that folder, it'll pull in your subgraphs automatically. But what's required is that you close Houdini and open it back up again. All right, so let's say now that we want to do this within a component script. And now that we have our tool, let's load in this subgraph with a component script. Okay, so instead of going into this pack folder, we're gonna go straight into this see and animate. And this is getting a little wiry over here. Let's rename these, create nodes. This is going to be blend pose comp script. Okay, so we need an apex edit graph. We'll jump in here. I'll pin this, jump down there and expose that. Okay. So within this, oh, and within the scene animate, let's reset this. So we go back to normal. Let's see. Okay. We have our joints here. Fantastic. So let's create. So we need an inputs and we need our outputs, and we need to rename these to get rid of all the underscores and numbers in order for this to work. Whoops, not params, I want output. So we'll need to extract the character graph, and then we'll need to update the character graph. Let's set up our inputs and outputs. So graph name will be rig name, character to character, graph to graph, graph name to graph name, and then character out. We can go into here and we'll say use second input, and now we still have our rig. So now what it's doing is it's just passing the rig right through without making any changes. So I'm going to open up a second window here to further illustrate how this is going to work. I'll pin that. And why don't I go here? Hang on. Let's put down an apex edit graph and we'll jump into this one. Okay, so this is my rig, right? This is how things are going to look. So just to start off, let's put down an add node. And when I plug this into the graph, we see that a node has been added. But we want our blend pose node, right? So within the callback, we just need to type in blend pose. Let me look over here, and now we have our blend pose node, or our blend pose subgraph, which is really nice. There's all sorts of things we can do here. We can give it a name, which we can do within our component. So why don't we actually do that? Do value string. Okay, let's put that into the name and reset. Let's take this, we'll reset this, and now I can actually, here, let's say, so blend pose name, reset this, and we'll just say blend pose node 01. Okay, and if I update this, now I have that. Let's actually go to the unpack folder here so I don't have to keep on updating this. Cool. So the next thing we're going to need is the root and the tip nodes that plug into the inputs here on our blend pose. So let's make 2 more value strings. Let's expand this. That's Control B, by the way. This will be our root. This will be our tip. Let's mark these so that I can see what I'm doing here. And then we'll have to find these nodes. So this will be find root, find tip. Let's plug in the graph, and the value goes into the path of each of these find nodes. And let's color everything so that we don't get lost in what we're doing. Okay, so now that we've found our nodes, let's make those initial connections. So we'll put down our first find and connect. We'll call this connect root, graph to graph, put that up, and this will be connect tip. And our blend pose node is going to be the source node on both of these, right? Because the connection is, it's not the source node, it's the destination node, the DST node. And because we're plugging into it, right? We're going in. So the input is the destination node. So we'll plug in this is going to be our root. So that goes into the source, that goes into here. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug in, here, why don't we jump out of here so we can actually see our graph updating in real time. Okay, I'll click on the connect root, press P, and we want the X form to plug into the root. And then we want the X form to plug into the tip. Okay, now it's not working yet because I haven't filled out this up here. So the root is going to be 0.0, and that's going to be, and you see now that we have these plugged into there. So I'm going to put down an apex layout graph. The apex layout graph automatically lays everything out when there's connections. So it's a little bit easier to see what's going on in your graph as you're updating it. So when we actually add our node, let's call this add blend pose. Let's give it a color so that we can, see how it's updating. Whoops, not like that. Let's give it a red color. Okay, so we have our initial connections. But now we have to fill out this bias and position here. So we have to build a dictionary to fill out the properties or these parameters in there. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's jump back into our component script, or put down a dictionary build, and we need two values. We need a float value and a value vector 3. Okay. This will go into the first input, that into the second input. And now we have to, in this dictionary node here, we have to label these the same name as those input parameters on our blend pose. So that means that the float needs to be called bias, right? Because that's what it's called here. And then this needs to be position, because that's what it's called there. And let's make two more inputs. This is going to be, now these names don't really matter. You can name these whatever you want, but I'm just gonna name them the same, bias and position. I like to make my dictionaries green. So now this, so okay, if we click on our blend pose node here and press P, we see that these values are set to 0. And if we plug this into the parameters, we see that they're still set to 0, but we saw the bias change here. So if I jump back into this component script, or rather the Apex component, we'll jump back here. I'll pin this so we won't lose it. I'll press P. And as we change this, we see that the parameters are being updated. Oh, I just realized that on my blend pose node, I spelled position wrong. So we have to spell that wrong too. Now it's working. So the dictionary is set up and we have all of our input connections set up. So now we just need to take this result and plug that into a control. So within our component script, why don't we also create that control? Okay, so I'll put down another add node, make this red, and the inputs, I always make these yellow. So this is going to be a transform object. And hang on, let me see my transform object. I just want to make sure, yeah, the name here, these are uppercase. Call this mid CTRL, and we'll make it blue. We'll plug this into graph and it gets added. Let's go ahead and connect. So this is going to be the destination node and our blend pose is going to be the source node. So we want to connect the value, or I'm sorry, it's not value, it's result, isn't it? Yeah, it's result. Let's take that, put that here. So one thing you can do if you have a complex setup that you just kind of need to visualize is you can actually just recreate it below. And so that's going to go into the rest local, right? So we need to go value into rest local, plug that in up here, boom. Oh, right. Yeah, it's not value, it's result. We just said that. Boom, there we go. Okay, so that's now plugged in, but I want to be able to see my actual node, right? Because if I jump over here and I start updating this, I can't see what's going on. So within our component script, let's go ahead and promote this t value and plug it into the params, into the parameter input here, so that we can actually see what we're doing. All right, and let's do this before this connection here. So let's move this over to the right. So first we have to find the port. I'm gonna plug graph into there, and this is gonna be our node ID. We'll click on this find port node, and we're gonna want the T in. Put down a promote input, and this is gonna go graph into there, port ID, and then let's plug this graph into there. So now the T is promoted. We can give it a name. Let's call it mid CTRL T. So now we have a unique name, which is important. You want unique names in your parameter inputs. So if I jump down here, actually let's jump to this. Let's go check this out. So now we have our subgraph working, and it's getting a little overshot here. If you wanted, for instance, to update this, because it's a little difficult to update it within the component script, right? Actually, it's kind of impossible. So what you could do is you can jump back to where you actually made it, make your update. Let's make sure that this bias doesn't go more than 1. So the max is going to be that. Hang on. This is going to be our value, and the max is going to be 1. Okay, now we'll plug that into there, and we'll save this to disk again, right? So we just overwrote our original subgraph, right? Our blend post subgraph. And now, again, we need to quit out of Houdini and open it back up and see if it's made those changes. So let's go ahead and do that. Great. So I'm back inside of Houdini, and we see now that we are no longer going beyond these 2 points, even though I'm going past one. So that clamp is now in there. So that worked. And now we have our tool, and we can go ahead and why don't we set that to 0.5? Let's say we want to move it up 1, and we'll update this. And now we have our tool. Fantastic. So this is the workflow that I personally use when I'm creating tools or just subgraphs or, just like a custom tool, custom component. And what's important here is to realize that you also have this component script here. So I would suggest to hang on to this component script, save it out, put it in a folder along or like a component script folder, so that you can just pull these component scripts back. So you don't have to rewrite your component scripts again when you want to reuse a subgraph. So the important thing is to try to do things just once. You don't want to have to redo it every other time you set up a new rig, right? That is the general workflow. Again, this is my workflow. You can always come up with your own workflow. It's up to you. This stuff is pretty flexible. I hope this was useful. If you guys have any questions or comments or maybe even some tips for me to make this easier, they're always welcome. And thank you for watching.